I know in my podcast people go, why do you mix history with, investigative journalism? I'm like, because that's tomorrow's history.
You're listening to the Good for Business podcast, where we feature interviews, tips, and tricks from owners, operators, and innovators throughout Mississippi and around the world. And now, your host, Colin Krieger. Welcome to the show, guys. My guest this week is the living legend, Shannon Evans, host of the Tombigbee Tales podcast, the biggest podcast probably in North Mississippi. It's pretty close. I'm sure there's some sports stuff that's bigger than you, but as far as historic podcasts and local stuff, you're the biggest in the business. Shannon Evans.
Oh, I don't know that I'm the biggest, but I might be the loudest.
You might be the loudest. Well, as many politicians can lower their shoulders and relax today, because we are here today to talk about the first 6 or 7 upcoming books that you've written on specific properties in Columbus. Is that true?
Yeah, I've written a series of 7 books. I'm going to drop 2 of them together, and then after that, I will release each one about a month or 2 apart.
Okay.
And they're all about 7 of the historic properties in Columbus.
Before we get to the books, why don't you give us a little on your background of your formative years in Columbus and elsewhere?
I grew up on South Side. My mother was a managing editor of the newspaper here, and she started out, of course, as a reporter, blah, blah, blah. And I grew up in the newsroom in the back of the Dispatch, and then I grew up running the streets of Columbus. You know, every kid grew up, we go to the Y all summer, and we rode our bikes the rest of the year, and we played capture the flag and flag football and anything else you could think of in at the W campus behind the old demonstration school. And yeah, I had the idyllic childhood growing up in Columbus. Fortunately, my parents moved around a bit in between, and then I've had a very fortunate upbringing.
Sort of everything sunny in the South, running through the fields and.
Yeah, kind of. I think I was the bane of my mother's existence at times, because I wasn't exactly. I was what was called the dismal debutante, because they were always trying to scrub me up and shove me in a dress or make me look like I was, supposed to. And I was out on the river. I was in the graveyards. I was out in the fields. I was off in the prairie somewhere. I was always looking for something to get into, and usually it had to do with history.
There you go. So after high school, did they send you to a premier finishing school?
During high school, I got sent off a couple of times. But, I muddled through like the best of us, and then I went to Ole Miss, and then I finished there. And I went to the Middle East, and then from the Middle East, I came back home.
What were you doing in the Middle East?
Oh, I was working as an engineer for an organization called Kirby Steel International, and then I decided that maybe building, although it was great, I was building platforms and doing a lot of the prefabrication for roller coasters and an amusement park, essentially. And I was just a very idealistic young person. And then I came home because there was some unrest there, and there was a group of people who came over and tried to blow up. Well, they did. They blew up the front of the American embassy, and they tried to blow up the French embassy and the English. Anyways, they took out a power station, and a little while later, I decided, maybe I didn't want to be there, and I came home and was in Columbus again for a brief period of time. And then my husband, who was a pilot, we kind of had to move around. So, we'd leave, and then the Air Force would see in its good mind to bring us back. It was like, hey, join the Air Force to see the world, and we'd keep coming back to our hometown. Yeah. So
I met somebody at the base, a lieutenant colonel up there now, who has been at 21 stations, and 5 of them have been Columbus. And he's just like, thanks. But I think he said of the 21, 13 or 14 of them have been San Antonio here and Montgomery. And so he's like,
Montgomery.
I really haven't gotten to see. I mean, he's like, I've been in Guam and Aviano or whatever, but he's like ends up back in Columbus. So I think he's going to retire here. So.
Oh, wow. Well, we left Columbus eventually and went to Europe and lived there for quite a few years. And then came back, but we lived on the eastern shore of Maryland. And he went to work for the airlines. And as our children got older, we parted paths. And as so often happens. Yeah. And, we still talk because we have kids and grandkids in common. But I lived in Seattle, then in Mexico, and then COVID happened. And we were like, what do we do? And I had super senior parents. So we decided in the middle of COVID to drive out of Mexico with a dog and with and all our possessions in our camper and drove out of Mexico to Mississippi via Arizona, Texas, etc.
There you go.
So we've had some adventures, and so here we are.
Well, good deal. Talk about the history thing. You said even when you were a kid, you were a bit of a history buff?
Yeah. I mean, I grew up in Columbus. I grew up in an older home. My parents owned an older, I guess you would call it late Victorian, Edwardian-style home on 3rd Avenue South. They renovated it completely. And, I always grew up in all the homes. I grew up playing in the Bateman's home, which is Arrelton, which is still in their family. I grew up playing in White Arches. My parents almost bought White Arches. We had extended family who once owned Riverview, so that was always interesting. And I used to babysit at the house in Riverview when the Murphys lived there. And, grew up chasing after the Sanders kids in the Colonnade. And so all these houses have names, and you kind of grow up knowing them and hearing the history, and it just kind of casually rolls off the tongue of people. And then as I got to be a preteen, and my older sister, my much older sister, because she'll kill me for that. My older sister and her pals were all ghost hunters, and I was fascinated with ghost hunting because it's just part of our culture as small children in the 60s in Mississippi, 60s and 70s. And our house was haunted. And so we just kind of went from house to house, and we started making home movies with the old little Super 8 cameras, and because we didn't have VCRs yet and video cameras. So we were running around making homemade movies.
Are those tapes hidden anywhere?
There's some photographic evidence. I don't know. You'd have to ask Mark Gooch. Maybe he still has them. So, or Jim Carnes.
Well, that's always neat because we just saw quite a big dump of photographs that went to Mona Vance at the library, and it used right on track about every 5 years. I think Bernie and Chris Chain found some paperwork about 10 years ago, like in an old building, and I think we're going to hopefully we'll start seeing more. As some older people pass on who've been in these houses for 50, 60 years. That the kids look under the under the bookcase, or under the dresser, under the bed, or in the attic, and see the things. And I think almost everyone in Columbus has a presence of mind not to throw it away. Although I can say I see I hear stories of tossed all the time. And you've only got so many yous and John Fields and Chris Chains of unreasonable people who see a stack of papers and don't realize.
Grab them.
And as much as Mona Vance is allowed, Mona Vance is the archivist at the library. As much as she's not allowed to scream in there, she is screaming from the top of the hill. She understands that there's a generational shift going on, and that this history can be lost because
it's quick.
Yeah,
it's quick.
There are only one copy of so many newspapers that they don't have there, and there's only one copy of wedding announcements and photos and stuff. And if that one copy gets tossed,
we're fortunate now that there's such a large digital footprint. So, I know in my podcast people go, "Why do you mix history with investigative journalism?" I'm like, because that's tomorrow's history. And so I'm documenting what's going on. And I've chosen a very narrow band. I've chosen, people who do bad things with our money. Yeah. that's just that's truly what so I'm either talking about history or talking about current business related to our government and our money. And so I always tell people, I was like, I'm not painting anything bad. I'm going, history's neither good nor bad. It's just history. And so how do we preserve it and how do we look at it? And so when I am writing my podcast, I'm writing about the people. I go out do whatever I do because I'm an oddball. I mean, I just know that.
Nobody is going to fight you there.
I'll just embrace that. Everything I find is documented somewhere. I'm not making this up. It's not, and most of it is documented in government records or in newspapers. And so, as fast as they can find them, there are digital organizations that are cataloging newspapers. Now, I wish we had more of the early African American newspapers that were published after the Civil War around the country. Those are starting to be uncovered in bits and pieces out of scrapbooks or whatever. Those are rich sources of not always accurate information, but it's like finding a breadcrumb, and so then you can go look for something else.
Yeah, it might tip you off. They'll mention a name. They're like, oh, I haven't heard that name before.
Exactly.
Or wherever you run into a dead end. Like we've talked about houses before, where you look up a house and you're like, there's nothing. And then all of a sudden you figure out it's the one thing leads to the next. And, history's written by the victors and the victims. It's just a lot of times the victims don't share their stuff. And, up until the last 30 years, I would imagine most black families would probably keep those things pretty tight to the vest.
They do, but we're starting to uncover, for instance, during the WPA era, there are some histories that are written. And, of course, as you said, they're written from a very white, very Victor-like perspective. But what we're seeing is that as we're pulling this information out, other people are coming forward, and they'll have like the Lomax tapes, who was a guy who went out and audio taped groups of people, or they'll find unknown recordings of music, or just these little snippets that will give us a window into that time frame and those people's lives, those individuals' lives.
Yeah, and we're in a lucky situation here. Of course, I grew up in New Orleans, which is the biggest gathering of antebellum Victorian homes in probably in the country. I know Boston and them have certain areas, but I mean, outside of even we should be or are competitive with Natchez in that respect. And I've been to Savannah. You can't. There's some historical stuff, but it's not. Yeah. What are 380, 400 houses in a small area here? We're just absolutely blessed that they're still here, because I think Starkville's down to maybe 3 semi-historic homes that they haven't bulldozed.
Well, being kind of so we were one of the wealthiest, if not the wealthiest communities, east of the Mississippi, south of the Mason-Dixon line, at one point. And so because of the cotton and the Black Belt Prairie, and we could go on and on.
Literally a plantation economy.
Yeah, it literally was a plantation economy. And then there were some industrialists that supported that plantation economy with the goods and things that were needed to make it be successful. And so we were very fortunate in that these people were very, very wealthy, and they built these beautiful homes, and these were their townhomes for most of them. Most of them owned also a plantation home. And the plantation homes are now gone for the most part. But their townhomes still exist, because when the plantation economy collapsed, they moved into the house, and the houses were so big, they often had several generations, and they could block off parts of the house to live in during the bleakest time economically and during the coldest parts of the year. And so the houses were lived in, unlike Natchez, where so many of the houses were bought up by garden clubs and organizations. So the bulk of our homes have remained as homes and home ownership, and families have lived in them. There are the stories of the ones that have been, former Lindemoods at what is now called, what's that one called now? It's not called Lindemood anymore, but that's post-Civil War, but and the original house that was there was pre-Civil War, and then it burned, etc. And so it sat empty for a long time, but that's kind of the exception and not the rule for most of the homes that are still preserved.
Yeah, well, my experience here has been almost all of the Big Daddy ones. Even Riverview's had 2 owners since I've been here, but it's constantly getting fixed. At least somebody's trying to live there. There's a couple of houses in town that are just collector items and sitting there, but mostly they've been at least taken care of. Now, of course, there's different. The W side of South Side has had some, obviously got torn down and developed a little bit in the 60s and 70s. And what I'm fascinated with the history stuff is history always leans towards the general or towards the big city. So you know, you hear that New Orleans and you hear Atlanta burned and you hear Philadelphia and Boston and that sort of thing. One of the most frustrating parts about history, and they do it a lot with music, is we're like, oh, the 80s and the 90s and whatever. And I'm like, a great example would have been COVID happening in 1920, and we're sitting here splitting a generation of music. And you realize once you're living in it that they're all very subtle changes, and you really shouldn't break them into just, you know, I mean, the best example probably in history is like 1910 to 1930. And they're just like, oh, 1910, 1920s was this, and the 30s were this. And I'm like, holy cow.
You're
like
missing a whole bunch of stuff.
Like it should maybe be 1903 to 1911, you know, like these weird periods. And so we try to fit things into a box. And that's what happens where people try to do the typical Southern story about Columbus. And they're like, it was this, this, and this.
Yeah,
you know?
like for example, they always talk about Columbus was a hospital town during the Civil War. Well, kind of. It wasn't a very small snapshot of the Civil War. And the Civil War is a very small snapshot of our history. And so there are those who like to hyper-concentrate what they're writing about. I like to look at it as an arc. Like, so the town kind of came into being in 1820. That's kind of a, you know, post-Treaty of Dancing Rabbit. A few people end up here, you know, the settlers start collecting. We think we're Alabama. We're in Monroe County.
Yeah, I love the Columbus, Alabama story.
Yeah, so we're part of, you know, we're Monroe County. So we had a whole history for 40 years before the Civil War. And then the Civil War was how many years ago? Well over 100.
Yeah.
So, you know, it's like, and so that was 4 years. It was a horrible 4 years. It was a shift in our psychic memory in this state and in the country. It was an important thing, an important blip on the time map. But in the big scheme of things, Columbus is so much more than that one little frame that everyone likes to write about. And so I just kind of roll my eyes and keep going and go, well, but yeah, that was interesting, but you know, we have some diaries of some women in that time, and Columbus was kind of boring. They you know, they were still having parties and they were still having soirees, and the war was touching them through their family members, and it was horrible. And there were some, you know, they had to do without things, but the rich were still living a rich life, and the poor were still living a poor life, and life went on for most Southerners in this town in that frame.
And I've never looked into it or asked about it or even thought about it to now. What's the closest, I know there wasn't a major battle, but what's the closest battle? Did we have cannons and gunfire coming through Columbus ever?
Well, it depends what you talk about. So there was the battle, the Battle of Bryce's Crossroads and the Battle of Okolona. Those are north of us near Tupelo. Of course, there's the Battle of Shiloh. And then, you know, Sherman on his ride went a little south. I mean, so Meridian kind of suffered a big hit.
Yeah.
And, you know, there were...
He rolled right down I-20, right?
Yeah, pretty much. So, you know, that was pretty bad. But our town was fortified, and the Black Belt Prairie was fortified for a reason. And that reason was, if we were to be a separate nation, the southern states, we had to have a bread basket. I can guarantee you that some of our cotton farming would have been alternated with wheat farming in the winter, because we would have needed bread. And, you know, we do love our cornbread, but you need wheat for a lot of things. So, you know, everything I've read, I mean, they talk about, what's his, was it not Jeb Stuart? Whoever it was, you know, Rufus writes about saying he came here, and he was friends with people here. And they said, he came here because his brother was taken care of in our hospital town, and that he was mad, and that's why he kept Sherman from coming to Columbus. Well, not really. A lot of that came back from Thomas Blewett and some others who were forward-thinking businessmen who were strategic leaders who were also serving in the military or had children who were sitting in very affluent places within the military, very critical places, and they had very distinct conversations about why it was critical to protect Columbus and to protect the prairie area. So they set up fortifications in Brooksville, and we used to play in the fortifications around town when I was a kid. Out Hemlock, if you went to see your friends, you went and rode your bikes in the old fortifications. And where I lived, we used to go out to the hospital, where Baptist is now, kind of behind Baptist, and then where there's a walking track, and where part of the new Baptist hospital wings sit. Those were great for riding your bikes on, and going up and over hills and stuff, and riding in between the old fortifications.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
That's pretty cool. Well, I was talking about how history gets generalized, and there's now, it's been a slow movement, I think, over the last 20 years, now that we have the greatest generation coming up. But some historians talk about how, like, before, for the longest period of time, they do it exceptionally horribly well with, like, Egyptian history and stuff. They're like, this is what happened, and then if they find anything small, they've got to cram it into, hey, the Egyptians weren't here 12,000 years ago. They were only here 6,000 years ago. And now there's all this other evidence of generations that have been lost of stuff, but they're still trying to fit them into boxes. And so it seems to be what you're doing with the books is building the history from the small story to a general one. So instead of trying to write a story about how the house served its way for a hospital town, you're doing the actual history of the home.
Yeah, so I start, the one on Wisteria Place, I talk about William Cannon, who built the home, and he was a plantation owner, and I talk about where he came from, and his family came from South Carolina, and he married his first, these people marry within their own families, because,
Listen, I'm related to the Cuvions from Franklinton, Louisiana, and as the great Chuck Yarbrough, history professor over at MSMS, has said, he goes, when we looked at your family trees, he goes, there were enough branches, but there were a lot of vines.
Yeah.
so yeah, there's a little bit of.
Well, our joke is our family tree's a stick. So,
Lord.
So I won't be pointing any fingers, but. The story of Wisteria Place, we have Samuel Meek, who married one of William Cannon. Died young. He finished the house. He barely finished the house. He moves his family in. It was to be their townhouse to go to church and for their kids to go to Franklin Academy and go to school. And because it's hard to go to school in the prairie, and it's a long ways out there, and it's muddy, and it's kind of lonely in the winter because there's not a lot of visiting and a lot of social stuff. All the social stuff was in town. So he built his town home, which is Wisteria Place. And he brought his family, of course, and his wife, and then he promptly dies. And he was a very good friend of Jefferson Davis. This is pre-Civil War. He dies in the 1850s. Everybody's sad. Everything goes on. So his daughter has married a guy named Samuel Meek, who is he's an attorney. He's well liked. He's dashing. He's handsome. He goes off in the military in the Civil War, et cetera, et cetera. And he has a brother who's much older. His brother's probably, 13 years older than he is. And he's an orator. He's a famous chess player. He's just kind of your Renaissance man. He serves. I think he was at that point. He was even in the Alabama legislature, and he was all these things. And so William's wife is a widow, and she's probably running low on money, and needs to have a little security going in. And maybe she fell in love with him. I would guess sounds like a really cool guy. I would have liked hanging out with him. He would have been cool to have in your house. And so she marries Alexander Beaufort Meek, and so she marries her son-in-law's brother, because it's Mississippi, and we do that.
Yeah.
And so they live there until their death, and then the house continues in their family. And so the book, I take the arc, and I take it from the builder, and we talk about James Lull and some of the craftsmanship and the uniqueness of the house. But then the story arc is to the present, and how it's always stayed a home. And so at one point, the guy who had the ice plant here in town owned it. And then his daughter owned it. I think it was his daughter. And then, they raised their children there. And then it sat for a little bit, and then they sold it. And then there's been several other people. And so I trailed the story of the house and the people who lived there, because those are the people who formed this town. Those are the people who are still forming this town, are the people who live in these houses.
So let's talk about when the books come out, or the first one coming out.
So I've got the first two is this book on Riverview, which is titled Riverview, A Monument to Greek Revival Architecture, because it is a fabulous home and the people who lived there. And then the next one is A House of History and Haunting. And they're both going to be, I'm having a private soft launch book party at one of the homes. And then the book will be available, because I'm trying to get it out in time for Black Friday, so that it's for sale at all your local booksellers.
Yeah, so that's aware. Okay.
Yeah, so it'll officially be available Thanksgiving.
So Wisteria Place, currently, Billy Cox has done a good job fixing up the house. And, of course, Riverview, Dick Like has
he's done a fantastic job.
Quite literally spared no expense.
Correct.
Is that correct? Yes, I've been in there. I remember right when he bought it, he kind of walked a few of us around, and I think it was with John Fields or something, and I had to have John there to explain to me some of the, there are furniture and mirrors in there that are worth more than an average home in Columbus,
absolutely.
And especially now that he's brought more stuff in. And I appreciate that, especially for somebody who's built a business. He started and owns Crylike, the national Crylike thing, and now he's semi-retired, but will never retire. Yeah, I just drove by him getting out, I think, for the funeral down the block, and just so generous with the money on that, because he doesn't have to be here. There are people who collect antebellum homes and smack some white paint on them and call it a day.
Yeah.
The town is littered with antebellum and Victorian homes where downstairs they look pretty good. The porches have always been redone, and then they have really nice furniture. And then you go upstairs, and it's just pink walls and window units.
Yep, pretty much.
And so a lot of people stop short of finished. For the record, at my house, which is Victorian, sort of late Victorian.
Yeah, yours is Edwardian.
We have pink walls and air conditioners. We do not have window units. So, but we went through and we redid the floors, and we got the crown mold in the right way, so that at least
you got a great staircase.
Yes, we do have an excellent staircase. So, so talk a little bit about Riverview. I don't think too many. I think some people know from a distance that Riverview is here, and they may have seen a billboard that said George Washington probably kind of slept here, maybe.
Well, no,
and that's about it. I think
that's a bald-faced character. So Riverview has always been a very interesting building. The guy who built it, his name was McLaren, and he started building it, and I think he kind of knew the winds of war were coming, and it was, Missouri Compromise, blah, blah, blah. All those things had happened, and he went, "Oof, I've got this great house. My wife has now died. I got these kids. I think I'm going to move to St. Louis." So he abandoned ship, and he sells the house. He sells it to a guy named John Gilmer. Gilmer was a lawyer, an entrepreneur, a planter, all those things. And he had the Gilmer. He eventually has a Gilmer Hotel. He was a very interesting fellow in that he did a lot of. He helped women get the right of ownership of their own properties. So women in your autonomy became your financial autonomy disappeared when you married, and your husband could gamble away your fortune, whatever, So he based his premise and what he fought for women. And Mississippi was the first state to give women the right to own their own property independent of their spouses. So if you inherited, it was yours. It was not your husband. Your husband didn't get it by right of default. And he based that on Choctaw and Chickasaw law, which is a fascinating thing to explore. And I talk about that a little bit in the book. But it's fascinating to me that he championed women when he didn't have to in that era. And I still haven't figured out why he chose to, but he did. And I'm glad he did. And And then he passes on, and the house continues to pass through different hands. It went to the Humphreys. William H. Humphreys was another interesting character. He was post-Civil War. He was one of the ones who helped with a guy named Jacob Hunter Sharp and S.D. Lee to form the Columbus chapter of the Ku Klux Klan for Lowndes County. They were men of their times. They were outnumbered, and they were trying to hang on to this ideology of the empowered white man, and they were scared about what, they were being fed a whole bunch of propaganda at the time, and they were scared for their futures. And then he kind of goes, yeah, that's not a good thing to be part of. And he's just he just kind of floats off into obscurity, and he and his wife actually renovate. They were the first renovation and modernization. They put in indoor toilets, etc. And then the house, I think after the Humphreys, it sits empties, and the Platts across the street buy the property, and it's a rental for a while, and then it goes into the modern times. Now, I stop most of the discussion by about 1940 or 1950, mainly because there are family members who are still alive, might remember it differently, might be some, everybody's got skeletons in their closet.
Yeah.
I mean, I could tell you some good ones about mine. My grandfather shot a governor in the backside, and who happened to be his first cousin, but that's a whole different bird hunt. But, a lot of people don't want their dirty laundry aired. And I don't look at it as dirty laundry. It's just history to me. But out of respect for those who are still living, who once were associated with those houses, unless I have their express permission to tell their story, I don't. Because that's their story to still tell. And it will be history. But for now, I'm just, with the exception of a few homes, unless it fits into the current story of its preservation, I leave it at a certain point in modern times.
So right now, how many houses are on your radar? Because I know you said, I think 6 or 7, but I mean, I can think of, there's definitely close to 40 that, have incredible relevance.
Absolutely. So, so much has been done about the antebellum homes here in town. None of it's in print anymore, for the most part. So I wanted to do these in groups of 7, and I want to start with 7 antebellum homes, and then I want to do 7 of what I call they're the Queen Anne Victorian homes, the ones with the turrets on the front, because we have a bunch of those that are fabulous, and there's great stories associated with them. And then I want to tackle maybe the storybook cottages in town. And so talking architecturally, why did people choose to build those styles homes? And what happened in our town that we went from the need for these opulent, huge homes, that people became more common sense about the homes they have. And then maybe if I'm still in the midst of it, I'll go back and add 7 more antebellum homes.
Well, there you go.
But these are not, these are 100 page at most. These are not thick books that, they're sourced. They're as accurate as I can make them. But even the ghost stories are accurate.
Yeah. Well, it's also going to be something nice for them to have if they're participating in the tour homes or something like that.
Or just want to know more about our town.
Yeah.
Or it makes a great little gift. Like you go, you came out to visit your kid, and they're learning, they're a student pilot. And you came to town and you went, oh, and you pick that book up and you can read it in a day. It's not that complicated. The whole goal was to make history accessible to everybody.
Are there going to be any pictures in there for people like me?
Oh, yeah. Absolutely.
Photos and drawings and such. So.
Yeah.
Well, we've seen, I've been in here 20 in town, 20 years next week. So, and we've been impressed on how many of the homes, at least if Northside had a movement about 10 years ago where a lot of stuff get fixed up, and then it kind of slowed down, and obviously it's happening again right now. And you can see we're seeing a lot of people who grew up here come back, or they come back to retire. And then we've seen other people like John Klostrom and others who come here and literally just stand here and go,
fall in love.
I can't believe it's this cheap.
Yeah.
You know, one of my good friends, an attorney from New Orleans, came to my crawfish boil, and he's like, I see why you stay. He's like, you can walk downtown. Your house is $2 million in a bad neighborhood in New Orleans. And, no matter what they say, the taxes aren't that bad on the older homes. And he's just like, it's like your own little miniature world while you're living here. And it isn't, of course, I don't know if we could brand it that way, but like Savannah and Natchez have this little everything's sunny in the South thing. And we have more of a PR challenge that we're working through. But there's a lot of people who do come here, who are just coming here because their kids in the Air Force and are like, oh.
We missed this, Jim.
Yeah, it's something that we can work for as a city to get that, and part of that is getting the correct history out about houses. And
it's more than the houses. I mean, I go every morning to the cemetery. I go to Friendship, and then when I get done with Friendship, I'll go over to Union because I love Union Cemetery or Sandfield, and I tell the story of somebody. I just go alphabetical and go, hey, that's interesting. The guy who I didn't know that this guy I knew all my life is considered the father of the B-52. And, and I'm like, gosh, I used to go out to Mr. Pete's place and go fishing when I was a kid. It's like these people you didn't know did these really cool things. Or people you've walked past their grave, you've seen their family, you've heard their names. There's buildings named after them, but you have no idea why.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, there's a guy buried out there that I'm getting ready to do a podcast on. His name was William Paul Odom. He wasn't from here, never lived here. I don't know that he ever visited here. But his parents moved here 9 months before he died. His father, he wasn't like a bank executive or anything. He was just an average person who moved here. And Odom held the record at that time for the fastest light plane flight from Hawaii, from Honolulu to the mainland. And so he did that. His plane is in the Smithsonian. And then it's like,
that's awesome.
Who knew? But then he goes up and he decides to fly in a speed race up in Ohio. It was very famous. It was the National Speed Races, and they had a course around a bunch of balloons, and somehow he's flying a P-51C Mustang that he'd never really flown, and it had been modified to be super fast, and somehow he got inverted and probably got the lanes or something, and he didn't have enough ground between to pull out of, and he hit a house and he died, and killed a woman and her child, and they'd only owned the house for 4 days. Yeah, and Dad and the other son are on the front floor or out front watching the air race, and yeah, not a happy ending. But they brought him here, and he's buried here, but his parents aren't. So when they died, and they've lived here the rest of their life, when they died, they're buried in Missouri. So it's like we don't know these people's stories. No one knows. You just go out to these cemeteries, you go, oh, that's cool. It's Uncle Billy Bob. Who's he buried next to? I think I did a little short piece the other day about a guy named, I knew for years, he worked out at Cash and Carry. His name was Lando. He had a twin brother named Lonzo. And the two of them were in the D-Day invasion, and one twin didn't come back. And he spent his life working at Cash and Carry. Who knew? He was a war hero. I never knew that.
It's amazing to me that what people don't like. I always say I would just open, like if I played in the NFL, even or tried out, I would just open with that. That's how I would introduce myself. I've told this to Isabella Powell, who helps with the Golden Triangle Theater. She was Miss University of Alabama, like recently, fairly recently. And she,
cool.
She's easy on the eyes and all, but I told her, I'm like, I would just open with that. Sort of like, Barbara Bigelow was a member of the Dallas
Cowboy
cheerleaders. I've told her, we share a birthday, and I'm like, I would just, every other conversation, it's like, by the way, I was a Dallas
Cowboy.
Yeah, like
and
I would
she's
just
still darling.
Yeah, and there's so many people in this town that that's part of the reason I started the podcast, because I was just fat. Like I'd be like, wait, what? You did what? You're this? You're like, you just think they're just the guy that owns the bar, the guy that the insurance salesman, and you hear these cool things, and I thought for a while social media would get people at the beginning of it to tell more about themselves, and I think it's even less because they're afraid of being a little goofy or being silly. People tease me all the time about when I post every morning when I go to work, and I'm like, I'm spinning and I'm here working. They're like, that's a little silly. I'm like, I'm silly at 5 a.m. I just am.
Well, I think one of the most fun moments I've had on Facebook was when you and I did that live at that house you had for sale.
Oh, yeah.
And I was hiding in the house. And I just like being, silly and yeah, I am serious and I bring serious topics, but I also sprinkle it with, there's it's interesting history here. It really is. And we need to embrace it and appreciate it because it's part of our identity, and we would have less of an identity crisis if we shared it. And if you knew, you probably never knew about the guy named Jim Longo who played football, in the NFL, who came out of Hunt High. You wouldn't know that one of the first black coaches up at Ole Miss was also a graduate of Hunt High, who had gone on to play in the pros and coached under Billy Brewer. We don't share these stories about our town. I think Chuck does a good job with the kids doing A to May and presentations and Tales from the Crypt. But those are kids, and so
it's made an indelible mark on Allison, who is in MSMS. Katie is in his class now, and she's like, "Well, my one of my classmates is doing the Donnell House on Military Road that you helped me find the history on, and that I restored." And I'm like to me as an adult, I'm like, "Cool." I think probably part of the challenge is that some of the MSMS kids aren't most of them aren't from here, none of them are staying here. But yeah, and so they have now my daughters have just an inclination for history just because they were next to him and so
I caution people that I go, okay, remember these are children, so they're not perfect in their research, they're not complete in their research. I wouldn't expect them to be, and they are given creative license, so they do add some embellishments.
Yeah.
But that's for the
show. Yeah.
That's for the show. So you leverage that and go, that's interesting. Now go find out what part of it was accurate, and maybe find out some of the peripheral people who they're talking about, because they mention others.
Yeah, they often do that. They're like, he was a hand for so and so to stables, and I'm like, what about so and so?
Yeah, what's so and so's story? So, the first iron ore furnace in Alabama was founded by two guys who lived in Columbus. Their names were Hale and Murdoch. And you look on some of the wrought iron stuff that's around town, it'll say Hale and Murdoch on it.
Okay.
They lived here. And their furnace was 25 miles away over near Vernon, Alabama, because that was where the iron ore was, and they saw it. They were industrialists who purposely moved here in the 1830s. One came from Worcester, Massachusetts, and the other one I think came from New Haven, Connecticut. And they came here with money and invested, and they built their homes and had the whole hoorah. But their business, they were merchant. They would sell their ware here, but the furnaces were over in Alabama. And there's still some historic signs over there. Never ever was I taught that. And I was in Coach Butler's history class where, one of the founders of MSMS and Tales of the Crypt and all that good stuff. Of all the things I learned about Columbus in his class, that was not one of the things I ever learned. And so I just found that fascinating.
Yeah, well, and sometimes, especially in the past, but just in the present, you have to be looking for it. You have to get around somebody who's going to share things about, like when I drive around, I'm like, hey, this house was falling apart 5 years ago and so fixed it, and Snowden got fixed, and this house got fixed. And, on the positive parts are driving around like, we have this much industry going on, or did you know the National Center for Unmanned Aeronautics is at Mississippi State? Like, I always tell people, I'm like, let me give them the tour. I don't need to sell them a house. just
let us show you around.
Yeah, or as I open with Air Force people, I'm like, or people that have to come here that I'm like, it's not that bad. We have multiple stoplights. We don't have much, I tell people.
You may have to pause for the possums and the armadillos crossing the road.
And, that's what growing up, Desiree, my wife, was born in New York, and I'm from New Orleans, and we've both been in big cities our whole lives and come up here. And now it's 20 years. And now if I catch that stoplight at Kroger, like, I am losing my mind.
Like, why?
I caught it twice once I was at Government Payday Friday when it's raining.
Yeah.
Like, that's a recipe for trouble. And I'm just like, and that's the equivalent of traffic, because I always give people that excuse. I'm rarely late, but if I am, I'm like, the traffic was nuts. And they're like, no,
Yeah.
it wasn't nuts.
I always tell people, I said, I wish I could take you up on every building in downtown and show you Columbus and point to things. I grew up playing on top of top of the buildings of this. Probably shouldn't tell people. I know how to gain access to almost every building on this in the downtown area, and the stories upon stories upon stories. The World Series game that one of our local AAA players, when there used to be a AAA team here, went on to play for, I don't know, the Yankees, the Giants. I don't know who it was. They went on to play, Major League Ball. This is early. I would say probably the 1920s. It's during the Great Depression. And so the Princess Theater, Mr. Kuykendall, would send his runner to the train station and get the telegram from whoever was at the game, and they would give him the top of the inning, the bottom of the inning, and then he'd come back, and they would and so they drop the mic and stand up there, and he would read the what the box score was and the description of what was going on in the game. They didn't have a pure radio connection, and so he's charged, I don't know, like 10 cents a seat. So all these people are sitting in the theater, and they've got picnic lunches, they've brought books to read, and everybody's having a great. And then as soon as he'd walk out on the stage, the place would get quiet. The newspaper articles are brilliant on that. I mean, it's just the descriptions are just fabulous. I mean, it's a bit yellow journalism, but because it's it's a bit flowery, but it was the era it was in. But it's fascinating to see the history of our town through those events. Because that's a small event. It's not a big deal. It's not like it was a war or, something drastic happened in this town. It was just everybody was excited because this baseball player that they knew and they liked, and he played in what was called, I think it was called the Cotton Series or whatever, their little, wherever they went and played. And then he made the big leagues.
Well, it explains a lot about a town, and that's where I thought, again, growing up in New Orleans, I'm a little rose-colored glasses about it. But that's where I think the articles fit in about the debutante ball or the thing like that. And Roger Larson, when he was at the Packet, did an exceptional job when he talked about parties, because he still viewed it in that manner, where he would be like, Philip Long came in and this, and he would just go through the guests there,
and the ladies,
and the lady. He was and he was still somewhat enamored by it. Which,
doing the society pages.
And we really like here we have they go to the JA ball, but not, and we all do. Like I take pictures of people at events, but like Roger did it was the last standing where he went. Yeah, which I think there's a place for that, for somebody to do something like that.
Well, there is, but when my mother first started, it's my understanding, I guess she first came in advertising, and my mother had a excellent journalist. She had an excellent pedigree in journalism from Vanderbilt, blah blah blah. So she comes in, and as a woman, Bernie Imes was not going to hire her to be in the newsroom, be in the the bull room. Blah. So she and Ms. D did Paste Up together and did the advertising, and mother was hired to actually write some of the copy, starting with the society pages. And so Mom started covering people's football parties. So, these people would have essentially tailgates, but before it was popular to go to Ole Miss to the tailgates. But it was local tailgates where you would get together and listen to it on the radio, and you'd have barbecues and cookouts and all that. Well, my mother knew more about football than most men. She still does to this day. My mother's sharp as a tack. And so she started weaving in the description of the game in that social writing about what the women were wearing and what was served and who were the guests and, blah, blah, blah. And I crack up because I'm going, oh, my God, you were giving a sports report. And so I asked her, I was like, how did you do that? And why did you do that? She goes, well, when I was a kid, I guess it was the Yazoo paper where my mother grew up. They hired these kids to be stringers, and they would go to all the local football games. And so I think she got like a Brownie camera or something, and a spiral notebook. And so she would go cover the local basketball, football, baseball games, and then she would run to the phone, call it in, and then they'd send somebody, or her father, somebody would take the film into town. And so, that was how it was done. And so she always knew sports. She always liked sports. And so she was like, I was already writing. Nobody knew that her name was Pat. Nobody knew that Pat was not a guy. And so that was how she started. So she was writing sports analysis because here she is. She's, here she is. She's a female, young aspiring journalist still in high school. And she's writing this great sports reporting.
So let's get on. Since we're wrapping up here, let's start talking about the actual books. And where can they find you? Where can they support you? And a little bit about the podcast.
Okay, my podcast is Tombigbee Tales. You can listen to it anywhere that you listen to your normal podcasts. You can also find my podcast and my films on YouTube at Tombigbee Tales. I have a website, tombigbeetales.com. These books will be available with any bookseller. So if you just want to go on, it'll be available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and your local bookseller will be able to order them through the Ingram catalogs.
Okay. All right. So check out the podcast. You're on almost every platform, right?
Yeah.
As far as I can.
I think I am on every platform, honestly. I know it's on Spotify and all the Apple products. And
well, I say this about Starkville Mayor Lynn Spruill. If you jump on Facebook and say something bad about Starkville, Lynn Spruill will introduce herself very quickly. And I same thing. If you say something on Facebook about history or just about Columbus politics or anything in general, Shannon will find you. She will hunt you down. All right.
I'm not that bad.
You're not that bad. This is a great thing. And thanks so much for coming today.
Thank you so much for having me as your guest, and I really appreciate your time.
Hey guys, thanks for listening to the podcast. My name is Colin Krieger, and my day job is real estate. If you're looking to buy or sell, I'd love to talk to you. Or if you just want to sit and talk real estate in a no-pressure situation, I'd love to help you. I work with RE/MAX Partners in Starkville, Columbus, and West Point, Mississippi. I can help you find an agent anywhere in Mississippi or anywhere in the country. Just reach out to our office at 662-327-7705 or find me anywhere when you type in 662-329-SOLD.